The entire hospital refused to enter his room. Doctors walked past the door without making eye contact. Nurses traded shifts just to avoid being assigned to him. Even the orderlies who'd seen everything during 20 years of night shifts found reasons to be elsewhere. But when the new nurse arrived for her first day, she walked straight toward the room everyone else had abandoned. What she found inside would expose a truth the hospital had been hiding for weeks. The isolation ward sat at the end of the fourth floor, separated from the main hospital by 2 sets of security doors. Room 447 had become something of a legend among the staff, not because of what was inside, but because of who refused to go near it. The patient had been there for 17 days. His chart listed him only as John Doe, approximately 60 years old, found unconscious in an alley downtown with no identification, and injuries that didn't match the story of a simple fall. The first team of doctors had treated him with the mechanical efficiency they reserve for transient patients. Clean the wounds, stabilize the vitals, run the standard tests, move on. But something had shifted on day 3. The head of emergency medicine, Dr. Raymond Keller, had walked into that room for a routine check. He'd emerged 12 minutes later with his face drained of color, immediately requesting a transfer of care. Within an hour, every physician who'd touched the case had quietly stepped back. The official reason given was conflict of interest. No one questioned it. No one wanted to. Sarah Chun had spent 6 years working in field hospitals before returning to civilian nursing. She'd sutured wounds in tents while mortars fell 100 yards away. She'd held pressure on severed arteries with one hand, while radioing for evacuation with the other. A quiet room in an American hospital didn't intimidate her. When the charge nurse tried to assign her elsewhere on her first day, Sarah had simply looked at the board, seen the gap in coverage for 447, and volunteered. The charge nurse had hesitated, then nodded with something that looked like relief mixed with pity. The room was darker than it should have been. Someone had drawn the blinds fully closed despite the eastern exposure that should have filled the space with morning light. Medical equipment beeped steadily in the corner. Monitoring vitals that the chart indicated were surprisingly strong for someone supposedly at death's door. The man in the bed wasn't sleeping. His eyes tracked Sarah the moment she entered, with a clarity that seemed at odds with his medical file. She approached with the calm efficiency of routine. Blood pressure, temperature, oxygen saturation. Everything normal. Better than normal, actually. His muscle tone suggested recent physical conditioning, not the wasting she'd expect from more than 2 weeks of bed rest. The injuries themselves were healing remarkably well. Too well. She made notes without commenting, but she felt his eyes following her movements with an assessment that felt mutual. "You're new," he said. His voice carried none of the weakness his medical status should have produced. "First day," Sarah confirmed, checking the 4-line. "They didn't tell you to stay away?" They suggested other assignments. He made a sound that might have been a laugh. "But you came anyway. Someone needs to." She met his eyes directly. "And you don't look like someone who needs isolation." That's when she noticed what the others must have seen. The tattoo partially visible above his gown collar wasn't gang-related or decorative. It was a unit insignia, one she recognized from her own time in combat zones. But it was the kind of insignia that shouldn't exist. The kind that officially didn't exist. The kind worn by people who operated in places that never made the news and conducted missions that never entered official records. The door opened behind her. Dr. Keller stood in the hallway, not quite crossing the threshold. "Nurse Chun, I need to speak with you outside." She finished adjusting the patient's pillow before turning. "I'll be done with vitals in 3 minutes. Now, please." The patient's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Amusement, maybe, or recognition of a familiar pattern. In the hallway, Dr. Keller kept his voice low. "I appreciate your dedication, but this patient requires specialized care that—" "His vitals are perfect," Sarah interrupted. "Better than perfect. His wounds are healing at an accelerated rate, and his muscle condition suggests he's been doing resistance exercises despite being supposedly incapacitated." She paused. "So either our charts are wrong, or someone's lying about his condition." Keller's jaw tightened. There are complications you're not aware of. Then explain them to me. It's complicated. I've worked trauma in Kandahar. Try me. The doctor's face shifted through several expressions before settling on resignation. 3 days after he arrived, I ran a standard fingerprint check for identification purposes. The FBI database returned a classified flag. Within 2 hours, I had calls from the Pentagon, the State Department, and an agency that wouldn't identify itself. They all said the same thing. Provide basic care. Document nothing. Ask nothing. And under no circumstances allow him contact with outside communications or visitors. Sarah processed this. He's a prisoner? He's not charged with anything. There's no legal hold. Just requests from people whose requests sound like orders. Keller glanced toward the closed door. The other staff, they got scared. Thought he might be dangerous. Or that treating him might make them complicit in something. I couldn't order them into that room. So I didn't. But you didn't discharge him. I tried. The same people who called made it clear that wouldn't be acceptable. So here we are. One patient no one will treat, and a hospital administration pretending an empty room on our isolation ward is perfectly normal. Sarah looked back at the door. What do you think he did? I don't know, and I'm not sure I wanna. Keller's expression softened slightly. Look, you seem competent. Overqualified, actually. You don't need this mess on your first day. I can reassign you to. I'll stay with him. You don't understand the position this puts you in. I understand perfectly. She met his eyes. Someone with power wants him isolated and forgotten, and everyone's too afraid to ask why, which means he probably needs an advocate more than he needs another bag of saline. Back in the room, the patient was exactly where she'd left him, but his posture had changed. More alert, she checked his chart again, looking for details she'd missed. The initial trauma assessment described injuries consistent with sustained close-quarters combat, not a mugging, not an accident, a fight against multiple opponents, all of whom had apparently lost badly given that he'd been found alone. They told you to stay away, he said. It wasn't a question. They made their concerns clear. But you came back. I came back. Sarah pulled up a chair, something none of the previous staff had apparently bothered to do. You want to tell me why the Pentagon's interested in keeping you here? Would you believe me if I said I didn't know? No. He smiled properly this time. Smart. Most people prefer comfortable lives. I'm not most people. I notice. He shifted slightly, testing his range of motion. The movement was controlled, economical, combat trained. You served 6 years. Army. Trauma nursing in forward positions. Afghanistan, among other places. She didn't elaborate. Some deployments stayed classified long after you left the service. Your turn. What did you do that has 3-letter agencies fighting over who gets to pretend you don't exist? Before he could answer, the door crashed open. Not Keller this time. 2 men in dark suits with the kind of haircuts and posture that screamed federal agents. Behind them, a 3rd man in military dress uniform. A colonel, based on insignia. His face carried the weather intensity of someone who'd spent decades making impossible decisions. The colonel's eyes locked on the patient. We need the room. Sarah stood but didn't move toward the door. This is a hospital. You need to coordinate with. This is a national security matter. You need to leave. Now! The patient's voice cut through the tension. Stand down, Marcus. The colonel froze. For just a second, his military bearing cracked, revealing something like shock, then fear, then a complicated mix of emotions that didn't belong on the face of a man used to command. Sir, The colonel's voice actually wavered. We didn't know you were conscious. The report said. The reports were wrong. The patient sat up fully now, moving with a fluid ease that made his 2 weeks of supposed incapacitation look like theater. And you need to explain why I woke up in a hospital instead of a debriefing room. One of the suited men stepped forward. General, the situation has evolved since your last operation. There were concerns about... General? Sarah's voice came out sharper than she intended. The patient looked at her with something that might have been apology. Lieutenant General James Ashford, retired. Technically, his attention shifted back to the colonel. Though apparently people are still making decisions about my life without consulting me. The colonel's face had gone pale. Sir, with respect, you were medically compromised. Command authority transferred to... I was shot twice, stabbed once, and thrown through a window. I've had worse Tuesdays. Ashford's voice carried the weight of absolute authority now. Nothing like the patient who'd been watching her take vitals 20 minutes ago. What I didn't have was a stroke or a head trauma that would justify stripping my autonomy. So explain, Colonel, why I've been warehoused in isolation while my team's presumably still in the field without support. The truth came out in fragments. A mission that had gone sideways. A target who'd had better security than intelligence suggested. Ashford had ordered his team out while he stayed behind to ensure they made extraction. He'd fought his way out alone, got into a safe house, then collapsed from blood loss. The agency had found him, patched him enough to travel, and brought him stateside. But somewhere in the chain of command, someone had made a decision. Put him in a civilian hospital under a false identity. Keep him isolated. Wait to see if he'd recover or if the problem would solve itself. You left me to die, Ashford said quietly. The words landed like artillery. Hoped I'd code on an operating table and save everyone the trouble of explaining why the mission parameters were wrong from the start. The colonel couldn't meet his eyes. Sir, I followed orders. Whose? Silence. Whose orders, Marcus? Joint Chiefs wanted deniability. If you died, the mission never happened. No one had to answer questions about why we had assets operating in a country we officially aren't in. The colonel's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. I'm sorry, sir. I thought I was protecting the program. Sarah had backed toward the wall during this exchange, trying to process what she was hearing. The patient she'd been advocating for wasn't just military. He was the kind of military that got people disappeared, the kind whose operations stayed buried. And she just walked into the middle of a cover-up that reached the Pentagon. Ashford's attention turned back to her. Nurse Chun. Sarah, you should probably leave now. This conversation's going to get uglier, and you don't need that on your record. You were going to tell me something, she said, before they arrived, about what you did. He studied her for a long moment. I make problems disappear. People who threaten American lives in ways the public never hears about. I've done it for 30 years, and I'm very, very good at it. He gestured toward the colonel and the suited men, which is why certain people get nervous when I'm conscious and angry. Are you? Sarah asked. Angry? Monumentally. But his voice stayed calm, controlled. However, I'm also smart enough to know that you don't work in hospitals because you like violence. You work here because you believe in helping people, even when they don't deserve it, even when they've done things you'd rather not know about. He paused. So I'm asking you, as someone who just spent 2 weeks being the only person willing to treat me like a human being instead of liability, walk away from this. Please. The colonel shifted nervously. The suited men had their hands near their waists where weapons would be holstered. The room had become a powder keg. Sarah looked at the general, then at the men who'd left him to die, then back at the general. Your vitals are stable. Wounds are healing well. You'll need follow-up care, but there's no medical reason to keep you admitted. She made a note on his chart. I'm documenting your discharge as of this afternoon. Against medical advice, naturally, since you're clearly not following doctor's orders. Ashford's expression shifted to something that might have been gratitude. Noted. She walked to the door, paused. For what it's worth, General, they were wrong to abandon you. Whatever you've done, whoever you are, everyone deserves someone willing to walk into their room. 3 days later, Sarah reported for her shift to find the hospital administrator waiting. She prepared herself for termination. Instead, he handed her a letter of commendation from the Secretary of Defense for exceptional patient care and professionalism. No details, no explanation, just a note that went into her permanent file and would follow her through any future position. She never saw General Ashford again, but 2 weeks after that, a news story broke about a major terrorist cell disrupted in Syria. No American casualties. No official U.S. involvement. Just another problem that had quietly disappeared, handled by people whose names would never make the headlines. Sarah kept working the isolation ward. And when other nurses tried to avoid difficult patients with complicated backgrounds or government flags on their files, she always volunteered because she'd learned something important in room 447. Sometimes the people everyone else abandons are exactly the ones who deserve someone willing to stay. If this story reminded you why compassion matters, even in impossible situations, hit that like button. Drop a comment about a time you stood up when everyone else walked away. And subscribe because there are more stories about the quiet heroes who refuse to look away, and you won't want to miss them. The next one might just change how you see the person everyone else has given up on.